Hello and welcome to our next Line Bridge event. I'm going to jump right in and hand it over to our speaker, Lasha. Thank you. You may now begin.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar on the art and science of learning. My name is Lasha, and I'm an e-learning manager at Lionbridge. If you're anything like me, a huge part of your workday is probably spent understanding new requirements, brainstorming on ideas, developing designs and wireframes, overseeing production, delivering to the client, and receiving fantastic feedback. It's like churning out training has now become second nature, and our minds are conditioned to process information in the most dormant of manners. While it's great to have experience sail our boat, it's rewarding to spend some time to truly understand and define our learning approach, be it a natural or acquired one, as this can be your litmus test and can help you reevaluate some of your design decisions and habits, ultimately contributing to your growth and success as a content designer. And that's what I'm going to attempt in today's webinar. So let's get started with the agenda. We will start right at the beginning by looking at what behavioral psychology is, what some of the different learning styles are, and how we can design impactful learning content. Let's move to the next slide. Psychologists often define learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience, be it positive or negative. This suggests that I, as a content designer, can simulate experiences for my learners that in turn can change their behavior through conditioning. Conditioning, in simple words, means interaction with the environment. This means change or learning will take place when I create a stimulus for my learners, and their responses to environmental stimuli will in turn shape their actions or experiences. Let me give you an example. I recently read a post on LinkedIn in which the person shared how his 2-year-old daughter gets excited each time he reaches out for his face mask. By experience and environmental stimuli, this little girl has learned that wearing a mask means an opportunity to go out. While this saddens my heart, this unfortunately is the reality for most pandemic babies, including my own. Have you ever experienced this environmental stimuli? Do you have any particular song that reminds you maybe of your past? I have a few that literally teleport me into my childhood. And I feel not just the same emotions I did then, but can also smell the same aromas of the wet summer mud, ripe mangoes, and believe it or not, my mom's talcum powder. These are examples of how people respond to stimulus and is a major contributor to behavioral psychology. But this is not quite the same as conditioning. Let's move to the next slide. Conditioning in psychology is a behavioral process whereby a response becomes more frequent or more predictable in an environment as a result of reinforcement. Now here, the reinforcement is typically designed as a stimulus or reward to obtain the desired response. So just like Pavlov's dog who learned to salivate at the ring of a bell, Skinner's mice have figured that each time they touch the lever, the postgraduate student breathes a sigh of relief. Well, who knows? Just saying. There are said to be 3 main types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. In classical conditioning, learning takes place through the formation of associations. So when we see lightning, we may anticipate thunder. Or when Bailey, our dog, hears the ruffling of a paper bag, he anticipates a treat. My daughter has a food aversion when we cook fish. Now, if you notice, none of these responses have been taught, but occur naturally, depending on how associations are formed. The opposite can also happen. When we see lightning, some of us may have anxiety, or the aroma of fish can make someone drool and feel hungry. As content designers, we have very little control over this type of learning, as it is purely dependent on the learner and their own experiences. Let me explain this with another example. Say you go over to a friend's place to watch a movie. It's a brilliant movie, has won tons of awards, and you have been waiting to watch it. 10 minutes into the movie, it begins to get hot. Mosquitoes begin to bite. And you decide to move to another room where the aircon is working. But the seating is uncomfortable there. I'm sure you get the drift by now. There is a very high chance that you will rate the movie poorly because of your viewing experience, which actually had nothing to do with the movie at all. This is the gray area all content designers need to be mindful of. And this is the part of the landscape you should be able to gauge when designing learning for a specific target audience. And here is when need diagnostic study comes in handy. It is very important to understand the problem at hand and to the best of our ability before we offer solutions. We once received a request for a very straightforward communication skills training. We were told there is a relatively new team, and in spite of being told multiple times, was not able to communicate project status to their manager in an efficient way. They lack office etiquette, is what we were told, and do not understand the seriousness of communicating project status in a timely and coherent way. A simple fix would have been to ask a few more questions on what the expectation is from the team. Are there any formats they need to fill in? What is the frequency? And for us to then offer an off-the-shelf solution with a few customizations to include the client's need. But, and this is a very big question, what if the client has misdiagnosed the need? In this case, I sent back 5 basic questions in an email and asked the client to have each person from the team reply to it. I knew the client did not have the time nor the budget for a TNA. But as a content designer, it was imperative for me to get that information. The results were what I suspected. The problem was not the team's communication or their lack of seriousness, not even business acumen, but the lack of respect for their team manager. This became our pivot, and we designed a communication intervention around it. The problem was still lack of clear expectations and communication, but the heart behind the matter was completely different. And I'm happy to report that after the training, the team dynamics began to change, and the team started performing well together with the same manager. Here we managed to unravel a very small part of the team's classical conditioning. And having understood that, we were able to create a new stimulus, which in turn brought about a different and positive experience for both the team and the manager. The next type of learning is operant condition. And as the name suggests, it works on the principle of reinforcements and punishments. Quite a bad word today. This theory is also called as instrumental conditioning. This method of learning, attributed to B.F. Skinner, who believed behavior which is reinforced or rewarded will likely be repeated, and behavior which is punished will reduce in frequency. According to this learning theory, the best way to understand behavior is to look at the causes of an action and its consequences. Sounds accurate? Well, we don't want to repeat unpleasant experiences and often wish and daydream for pleasant experiences. These mice that you see on screen were a part of Skinner's operant conditioning chamber experiment, where he objectively recorded the mice's behavior in a compressed time frame. When you think of it, it's not very different from our own behaviors. How should this then be weaved into our learning design? Some of you may think badges, monetary incentives maybe, feedback scores, recognition among peers and leadership maybe. And for negative reinforcement, maybe not giving a course completion certificate unless a minimum score is achieved, or maybe not being eligible for a promotion that requires a certain number of training hours and a 95 score or above, or perhaps something more creative. I'm sure by now, designing these positive and negative reinforcements is like pulling a rabbit out of the hat for us. This is one area of e-learning I have seldom seen challenged, unless the stakes are high, of course, and the effectiveness of the training is being gauged and there is an expectation of an ROI. But how many such courses have you really come across in your entire career? I can actually think of just 2 instances where we implemented a close to ROI feedback mechanism. So then what about the other training we designed? How can I be mindful and creative in the way I integrate reinforcements and punishments in my training as a content designer? Let me give you another example. Some of us may be highly motivated to complete online certifications if our organizations play for it. We think it's a great opportunity to learn and sometimes also pursue accreditations that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford or get through a particular training institute without the collaboration and influence of our organization. Now here, personal growth and learning is the motivation. It's not motivation enough for me to spend my own annual income on, but motivation enough to work hard and manage my other responsibilities while pursuing these online certifications while my organization offers me the opportunity to do so. At the same time, there are others who are not at all motivated by personal or professional growth, but are motivated by money. So if the organization offered a certain amount of cash credit each time an employee completed an online certification with a perfect score, there is a very high chance that this group of people will be motivated and will ensure they complete the certifications. While this is a very crude black and white example, I hope it helps explain how we are all driven by different motivations and in different degrees, depending on the situation. As content designers, then, how can you ensure the maximum benefit of operant conditioning? Perhaps providing more options or learning paths could be a good place to start. At Lionbridge, there are a few mandatory courses that offer 2 levels of gameplay. One is a straightforward level 1. Read the text, move on, check your understanding, and you're done. And then there is level 2, where you can choose to play a game and compete as you respond to each question. There is no reason to design motivation into these trainings. They are mandatory and need to be completed to be compliant. But because we care about the learners and value their time, motivators have been built in these run-of-the-mill mandatory trainings too. The third type of training or learning is observational learning. It is said to occur by observing the actions and consequences of other people's behaviors. This is when targeted behavior is watched, memorized, and mimicked. As a 7-year-old, I remember watching a few older kids work on long division. Something about how their mouths murmured as they recalled the times table mentally, and how artistic their strokes looked as they drew arrows to pull numbers down to solve the problem captivated me. I'd spend hours in my room mimicking the long division because I was so enamored by the choreography of the numbers and the gentle movement of their lips. I'm sure we all have organic experiences like these where we've observed a behavior and mimicked it without really truly having understood it at all. Imagine having the power to simulate these experiences for learners. And this is the core of any content designer. We can create these experiences by allowing learners to be an integral part of the real-life scenario where they're free to experiment, have the opportunity to exhibit the intended behavior, observe outcome, both positive and negative, and assimilate learning. Learning design does not necessarily have to depend on the client's budget or timeline. It's only the execution that is bound by these parameters. I can design the same intervention either as a 250-word case study as I can as a podcast or a 5D fully immersive game. While the visuals and the medium play an important role, the emotions are evoked in the learner heavily depend on our learning design. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, having said that, there are a few basic assumptions that these conditioning theories make, and these are vital for us as content designers to keep in mind. All behavior is learned from the environment, and that psychology should be seen as a science where theories need to be supported by empirical data obtained through careful and controlled observation and measurement of behavior. Let's think about this one a little bit. A child is never taught to lie, but has to be taught to say the truth. Would you say that is a response to their environment, or it's just a sinful nature of mankind? The second assumption is operational definitions, where variables are defined in terms of observable, measurable events, and the theoretical goal is prediction and control. This does not address subliminal perceptions or biases. The third assumption is behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behavior as opposed to internal events like thinking or emotion. Fourth, there is little difference between the learning that takes place in humans and that in other animals. And fifth, that behavior is a result of stimulus response. If you notice in these assumptions, you'll be able to draw the conclusion that learning theories focus on how we respond to events or stimuli rather than emphasizing on what motivates our actions. These theories provide an explanation of how experience can change what we're capable of doing or feeling. And these assumptions are what we should be aware of when making any design decisions. Fortunately or unfortunately, there is no clear black and white. Let's move to the sixth slide. So far, we focused on behavioral psychology and nuances of a content designer. Let's now shift our focus to the learner. How do people learn? There are tons of theories available online on how people learn, from WARC, where learners are categorized according to their learning preferences, into visual, oral, read-write, and kinesthetic preferences, to Gardner's 8 multiple intelligences, where human intelligence is differentiated into 8 modalities, to maybe Bloom's taxonomy, which encourages higher order thought in learners by building up from lower level cognitive skills, to Jung's scale of cognitive learning style, and many, many more. I'm sure you all agree that over the years, each one of us has pulled from these various theories and have come up with a highly coherent working model, which is now truly our own signature blend. This model of ours may not hold the status of a grand theory of explanation, but is definitely a helpful way to make sense of the world around us and to design impactful training for our learners. Let's move to the next slide. Now, while there is absolutely nothing wrong in creating a hybrid model that works for us, and there are a few core elements we should test the hybrid model against, this will ensure you reap the maximum benefit from the plethora of learning theories and strategies available, and will also give you a sense of when you need to upgrade yourself, imbibe newer influences in your content design. Your hybrid model should have these beliefs at its core. Remember, learning is a social process conducted, either more or less directly or with other humans. People begin to learn by trying peripheral activities and then take on complex activities as they grow in confidence and see other people perform them. People repeat actions that are associated with a reward, including the approval of peers. Even if the aim of the learning is not behavioral, having an associated behavioral outcome can make it easier to communicate and assess. And people learn most or most profoundly when faced with a dilemma or need to understand something that is relevant to them. Let's move to slide 8. When we say learning is a social process, it means that it is multifaceted construct, which includes both internal and external factors. Let's move to slide 9. To build effective learning, we need these 3 cornerstones: construction, cognition, and community. In construction, learning happens when you build or make things. In addition to the physical or digital output of your work, or what we have to learn in order to complete them, we're also forced to construct new mental models or analogies or memories or synaptic connections while we build and create things to add to our world. For more research on this, you can start with Wikipedia article on constructivism and dive as deep as you like. The next cornerstone is cognition, where learning happens when we think through things. We make observations, we process feedback from our environment, we simulate and predict, and then we update our predictions. All of this is really hard to see since it's often just a facial expression. So we have to come up with things like tests or assessments to try to get to know how people have started thinking differently based on readings and observations and conversations. There is still a lot more to learn about how we think and how we modify our thinking over time. And the third cornerstone is community, where learning happens when we want to survive and thrive amongst a group of people that have a shared collection of practices. Maybe we want to be able to do what others do, or maybe we just want to be accepted by people who validate our identity. Humans are tremendously good at observation, imitation, and innovation, and often in that very order. Let's move to slide 10. Is then the process of learning an art or a science? I read an interesting article which spoke about the difference between learning physics and painting. And the author explained how on the surface, almost everything is different. Physics uses math, painting uses brush strokes. Physics requires abstract thinking, painting requires concrete perception. But at a deeper level, learning painting and physics has a lot of similarities than we realize. They both involve concepts of force and composition. They both involve skills of calculus and color mixing. And they probably learn best through practice, which tells us that learning is a process of organizing information in a logical sequence in order to present new information to learners, while at the same time activating and scaffolding the learner's existing knowledge. Let's move to slide 11. How should you then approach learning as a content designer? As you've heard today, learning is not a one-dimension process. It takes place in many different ways, and there are a wide variety of factors that can influence how and what people learn. While people often focus on the observable and measurable ways that learning takes place, it is also important to remember that we cannot always immediately detect what has been learned. People are capable of learning things that are not immediately observable. Let's move to slide 12. If you are looking for a reliable guiding construct, I would recommend MAYER'S 12 principle of multimedia learning. While these do not comply with accessibility principles, they still remain relevant today and is something that you can gauge your hybrid model against. I hope you found this webinar helpful. I wish you the very best in your journey as a content designer. Thank you so much for joining me today. Bye-bye.